We have one more panel that we're going to have now, which is going to explore Regtech, the technologies used in regulation. And in fact, when we're exploring this sort of thing, there's always the question, is this about regulation specifically? Or is this about how we run our businesses? And then hopefully the regulatory issues can emerge from it. Certainly within the technology industry, it has been historically about what the regulator wants. But now it's widening in scope. And it'll be interesting to see the directions that our panelists take us in. We have two panelists who are joining us. We had a third. And then I think somehow we scared him off or something. I don't know what happened. Maybe we were going to do the improve. Have we improved the quality? Okay, I hesitate to comment on that one. Perhaps we scared him off with the beauty contest. Yeah, you never know. Anyway, so we have two panelists here, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. But we're capturing Regtech from the side of banks and large organizations, and we're capturing Regtech as seen from the perspective of a startup. So I'm looking forward to hearing what both of you have to offer here. But first, Kevin, I wonder if you just give a brief introduction to yourself, and then I'm going to ask you to provide some comments on this area. But can you introduce yourself? Why are you here? What gives you the right to be on this panel?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. Very pleased to be here and to be part of this discussion with my panelists, and hopefully we'll get lots of participation from the audience as well. I am in Alvarez & Marsal, which is a professional services firm. I'm with their financial industry practice. Alvarez & Marsal is a US-based, formerly boutique. We've now got 3,900 people, so I think we've gone beyond the boutique size, with offices across the globe. Now, the history of Alvarez, if those of you may or may not have heard before, in financial services is around Lehman Brothers. Lehman's wind down globally was handled by Alvarez & Marsal, which is actually the start of our financial services practice. I'm in that practice. We still do a lot of bank restructuring, even though we hardly see any bank restructuring in Western Europe nowadays. We also have a regulatory advisory practice that we've built, comprised of ex-regulators, ex-supervisors, and former people from the PRA, FCA, those of you from the UK, ECB, and a lot of the other regulators as well. In fact, I think there's a name on here, Ivana, my colleague, who's meant to be here today. She couldn't make it. And she's with the Dutch, or formerly with the Dutch regulator. The third piece, which I sit behind, is operational improvement. Now, the model of Alvarez is slightly different from some of the other firms in that I think the talent or the people that we have inside tend to be not lifelong consultants. We all have come from an operational or a regulatory bent. I myself was a strategy consultant over 8 years, spent 10 years in investment banking, and now have been with Alvarez & Marsal for about 2+ years. So we see things, I think, from the bank context, our clients, and also the regulator, because it's a heavily regulated industry, as you can imagine. So that's probably where I'd share more insights from this whole Regtech question.
So you're not a regulator, but a lot of your colleagues are. You've come more from the strategy and investment banking side. You've presumably seen technology being used on a widening scale out there. Where does Regtech fit into the big picture?
Which is a good point. I think one of the things that press does is try and compartmentalize technology so that people can understand them. So Regtech is just a term to compartmentalize technology developments, looking at regulatory compliance and regulatory requirements. Technology has been a part of banking ever since the beginning, I guess. ATMs is an example. But rather than talking about the whole fintech developments, which I think a lot of people are familiar with and you hear a lot more, Regtech is a sub-segment of that. It really emerged as a vocabulary term, I think, in about 2014, where the first encapsulation of Regtech came about. That doesn't mean that the technology that's supporting it didn't exist before, and it's suddenly, boom, we have Regtech. Before that, you have a lot of governance, risk, and compliance software, a lot of accountancy, forensic tools that was just in banks. It's just that now we have this focus around Regtech and some developments arising from that, I think driven mainly by the fact that we have a lot more computing power, a lot more analytical capabilities that we'll hear from yourself. And this also interesting equation, which is the regulators themselves, which I'll cover later, are taking a keen interest in.
So when we talk Regtech, how wide is the footprint that we need to be taking into account?
In banking, it is probably one of the most regulated sectors and activities. If you look at the rule books out there, it probably stipulates everything from the very beginning of onboarding clients to conduct, to your capital and prudential requirements, to another extreme, which is treating customers fairly. It really is very broad. So if I share with you some anecdotes of the areas where we're seeing the most development using technology, just running through a list. Certainly, financial crime is one big area you hear about. And it's starting from identity to KYC, knowing the client, customer due diligence, and then the whole AML, anti-money laundering controls around that, making sure that transactions are not supporting terrorism or money laundering. Then you move into the other extreme, which is reporting. And since the financial crisis, I think you'll see banks have just a huge amount of reporting to do. And reporting is effectively putting data and information into packages size for the regulator. But for banks, it's quite complicated. If you are a multi-jurisdictional bank with multi-business lines, you can just add the permutation of business lines across jurisdictions and regulators. It's quite complicated. Then you have the in-between, I think, which tends to do with more conduct-related activities. Is in the UK, those of you from the UK we've got this senior managers and certification regime where you have to demonstrate very good supervision of your business. And there are examples in the past in banks where rogue behavior has brought down banks, caused a lot of losses. Mm-hmm. The regulator wants to make sure that management teams are on top of that. And there are tools coming out to help you be better supervision, better monitoring of that, which we can go into later. I think the other aspect, which is part of this whole Regtech development, is more boring. It's just basic standardization, automation of mundane tasks. So we heard about robotics earlier, but there's this term robotic process automation. It's just automating very simple mundane tasks to free up capacity of the compliance and risk teams to focus on other more higher valued, higher issued topics.
Well, we've got more questions for you along the way, but thank you for that introduction. And if you have questions, please do use your Slido tool so that we can capture them. But I want to quickly ask Casper. Casper, can you introduce yourself? I would imagine that most people would not know what Calcabis does. In fact, what does Calcabis mean?
I would be surprised.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. Okay.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Casper. I am CEO and founder of Calcabis. Calcabis is a Danish-based and Danish-started artificial intelligence company. So basically, it's basically a spin-off from the medical industry where we started in 2004. So working with regulations there as well. So what we do is that we provide a toolbox with all the artificial intelligence components that you have out there. So everything from the analytics part, for machine learning, deep learning, to the RPA, to computer vision, to being able to recognize pictures, natural language processing, so you can actually read documents and text, natural language generating, so you can generate text. And then the baseline, which is the cognitive computing. So we wanted to build a computer that was as close to the real, the real world as possible. So we have built a platform where we combine the different components of our AI to actually solve specific tasks. So we tailor artificial intelligence to companies and do it in a very humane way. So To give an example, us as human beings, we are able to collect information, we are able to look at that information, interpret it, we are able to document it and describe it afterwards. So that's basically what our computer is able to do automatically. So yeah, it really varies in terms of what type of tasks that we need to automate, what types of AI components that we put on top of that. So basically we can support everything from the analytics part to the process of that. Because what we see, especially in banks, is that, and I also looked at the discussion before. A lot of the large companies are talking about data analytics, which is, of course, you need the data, you need to structure data, so there's a lot of work to be done before you can actually get some output. Once you get that output, you will actually just take the monkey and put it into a different department, because then you need to actually figure out what do you need, what should I do with this output, and you need humans to actually process that, and we can take that process as well and automate it. So yeah, it was a very interesting discussion before, and also what we see close up, that the big firms out there, they're struggling with actually cracking this code. And I think it has, as also mentioned, has something to do with actually attracting the right talent. And I think the reason that you're not able to attract the right talent is because we tend to do it ourselves. So yeah.
So it's interesting when I hear you talk about analytics and artificial intelligence and natural language processing and lots of answers. And when I heard you talk, I heard about the challenges, which is you're trying to do fraud prevention and you're trying to know your customer, and they're the problems that the organizations face. How do you end up having a conversation with each other? How do you connect the problems with the answers?
Well, it's pretty easy, because let's take the onboarding process, for instance, right? So you need to verify that the ID is the correct ID. You need to do some PEP screening. You need to know who the beneficial owners are. Is there any types of fraud? So the whole onboarding process is divided into specific steps, right? And all these specific steps are basically based on rules and processes, right? So again, it has something to do with us. We don't know anything about. We know stuff about AI, and that's basically what we know anything about. Because what we are going to train our computer in is based on knowledge that companies possess already. So they do know what to comply with. They do know what types of different data sources that they need to analyze, and all of that. They actually have that knowledge. They just don't know how to anchor it and process it. And that's where we come in. So basically, we sit down with clients, figure out, okay, what is the specific scope that you actually want us to solve? And then we dive into, okay, how do you do it today? Why do you do as you do? Who are you speaking to in your organization? And all of that. And all of a sudden, they figure out that they actually need to have a lot of different departments, on top. So the risk department, the asset management needs, the whole regulatory space to be, fulfilled before they can process that. And then we basically take one step at a time, right? We have our struggle with IBM Watson, because they usually come in and say we can solve the whole thing, just like that. And that is just not the approach that you should have to artificial intelligence, because it's very complex. Because you really need to understand what you want to gain from it. And when you know what you want to gain from it, then you, of course, need to know, okay, how do you do today? We actually have a concrete example where we are sitting with one of the largest banks in Denmark, and they really wanted our system. So we, of course, talked to them. And we told them, well, all the knowledge that you have already, just put it into our computer. And they just, said, we don't dare to do that, because what if we are wrong? So they actually wanted the big four to support that information that was put into the AI. And I think there is, because there are so many regulations and so many legislations that you need to comply with, it's getting more and more complex. So. Yeah.
So it sounds like quite a consultative engagement when you're providing your stuff.
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Because
let's see, Kevin. You're a consultant,
yeah,
I presume.
just
So
to add, I guess that's sort of in that dynamic is where consultants have a role to play, not just us, but a lot of other firms as well. When we spoke to and we speak to a lot of bank compliance and risk heads, it's how does a firm embrace innovation into their current processes? That's not exclusive to Regtech. It's the whole fintech movement. So if you break it down, it starts with what is the problem I'm trying to fix? And a lot of times you find clients jump into looking for the solution before they understood their problem. And that's one of the failings they have, because you get caught up in the hype. My next door neighbor is doing AI. I have to do AI.
30 or 40 years of the tech industry has been grown by people just buying things they didn't know whether they wanted it or not.
Yeah. And then something that you mentioned, which is quite key, is because it's a regulated environment, in banks, you often find that it's decision by committee. There's always the compliance person that's there, the business owner, there will be IT there will be someone eventually from legal and compliance, and they all have to agree. And you find that they all sit in their own silos, they all have their own view, that it's oftentimes hard. It takes a lot of steps to get people to align whether it's an IT question or a compliance-related question. So what some of the more sophisticated clients that we deal with are doing is they're putting them together. So take compliance, for example. It used to sit on its own in risk or in legal. There are actually banks who say, now, I want the IT teams that support me to come in and sit with my guys or girls. Because the idea is that this cross-pollination of why is this rule important and how do you think about it from an IT perspective needs to permeate between both sides. So that's one of the equations. It's just, organizational behavior. The other thing that's key is, I think with the adoption of innovation in banks, there's this embracing of this experimenter's mindset that needs to pervade more banks, where it's hard to have an IT solution that's perfect right out of the box. And in the past, people would buy SAP and they expect to be perfect right out of the box. But for a lot of the new technologies, it takes working with people like Calcabis in iterating and sharing openly the problems, really, and being able to trust that we will come to a solution together, but it's never going to be right on the first go. And that journey is sometimes not possible in certain bank environments, just how they are run. So there are some banks, we interviewed a bank in Singapore, which was Digital Bank of the Year 2 years ago. And it was quite interesting because they have cascaded from the top down this experimenter's mindset. So one of the measures for any MD is to run 2 experiments, any kind of experiments, tech experiments, a year as part of their appraisal process. Whether it works or doesn't work, you just have to run 2 experiments with your IT colleagues. Then that pervades the organization. So when a technology tool comes in with a problem, there's already this facilitating culture to get the sides to work together.
I think it's a very valid point, because the technology providers you have out there today are cheap, right? You can actually get a lot of things done and tested out, just throwing a couple of 100,000 into it. So the startup environment is very agile, and they have some really cutting-edge technology that you can actually test very fast. So I think it's a very, very good way of actually testing out, does it work or doesn't.
Right. I'm going to take a brief halt at this point, because by now you've got used to the idea we're going to use Slido, right? So let's have our Slido question up. And our initial question is, what does Regtech mean to you? So is it not showing up? There you go. What does Regtech mean to you? So a whole bunch of you have already started on this. And we're just asking you to comment on this. Is it a way to reduce compliance costs? Is this about automation of due diligence processes? Is it to facilitate communication with regulators? Or really, you don't know? Also, we've managed to leave out the "and I don't care" bit. But go ahead and put down your answers on this. So it looks like it's a fair blend across the. Never heard of it is winning at the moment, right? Yes, so I guess both of you have a task to do out here, but we're not going to let anyone leave here till they've heard of it. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. So we're going to deal with that issue. But it does look like a way to reduce compliance costs is one of the things, and automation of due diligence processes, communication.
I'd like to cover the cost issue a bit.
Yep, please.
So I'm not sure, just asking around, has anyone been part of a legal and compliance team in a bank before, across the audience? Okay, one gentleman. You would have seen that, the reason why cost is important to compliance is that it's just out of control. Since the financial crisis, you've had a lot of litigation for past misdemeanors or past transgressions of rules. You have also the onslaught of a lot of new regulation, which is just being absorbed by the system. And it makes for a very complex and costly compliance effort. If you look at how banks have dealt with a lot of the new regulations, it's oftentimes a spreadsheet and a contractor. And they hire a lot of them because it's a quick fix, which gets them and keeps them out of prison management. But it's not sustainable in the long term. So really we're seeing a consciousness now to say, how do we fix this process to be still compliant, but also more cost effective in the long run? And the sense is that Regtech is actually going to be the catalyst for this, because it's just a tool to fix the compliance process. It probably is too manual or too wrought with issues. The other thing I'll say is, just some stats out there. So, this sat about 321 billion in fines paid by banks. A lot of it you'll find is in the FinCrime, AML space, hence the focus of FinCrime. You see, Regtechs are very smart. They go to where the money is. The other thing is that Thomson Reuters has this stat that says how many regulatory alerts you get globally from all the regulators, because a regulatory alert can be very simple or very complex. It just says, I'm the regulator for this jurisdiction. If you do this, this is my new adjustment to the rule. Please absorb that, implement that. There are now 50,000 of that a year. It's been happening since 2015. So if you are a global bank, multi-jurisdiction, dealing with many regulators, you have to deal with close to 50,000 of that coming into your compliance divisions and trying to navigate, what does this mean for me as a business? What do I need to change? It's very complicated and complex. So underlying that are the two drivers why Regtech is, I guess, coming up as a means to address these two issues.
Okay, I'm going to pick on one of the questions that has come up via Slido. And it says this: as soon as the law has been written, ways of evading it have been found. Now, it turns out, according to the questioner, that this is an Italian proverb. I've come from New Delhi. I always thought that was an Indian proverb, but it must be mixed up on this. But the question is this: how do you make sure you find the gaps before the bad bankers find them?
Well, if it really depends on how your infrastructure is, because if it's built up of legacy systems, which most of the banks are still, then it's going to be literally impossible unless you have 2,000 compliance officers and legal consultants on top there.
So is this where the experimental idea is important, that you're able to keep developing and moving the system on?
Yes, because if you have built this up, there are different ways of doing it, and I know that a lot of things are happening within blockchain. But again, that raises the question: whose blockchain are we gonna enter and all of that? But I think that you could actually, based on real AI, you can actually you can eliminate all the blind spots, because if the system is built up right, then it will alert you where are the dangers and the holes in the cheese, if you may. And you can put it into a test environment before you go live with it. So already there you can actually test it and see, okay, what type of impact would this have if I actually go live with it. And if you are on blockchain, or if you have a artificial intelligence platform built up, then you will instantaneously know, okay, what do I need to do with this? What impact does it have? Okay, what do I need to comply with now? and the computer will actually already, be sending out information to the beneficial owners or what it may be. So you could actually comply with that instantly, but it really requires that you build up the AI platform in an agile way. So we always say to companies, if you don't choose us, choose somebody else that actually can do the whole thing, because otherwise you will end up having 50 different AI technology companies providing 50 different solutions, and you will end up with the same struggle as they have today with legacy systems, because they're not able to communicate real time with each other. So they really need to think ahead. Yeah.
It's interesting you talk about agile in the context of a bank. Now, I would have almost said, that's surely not possible. And yet, last Tuesday, I was involved, I hosted a meeting in London where a number of companies came around to talk about, new ideas around integrated thinking. And ING was one of them. They came. And they talked about how they're putting agile as a business practice into much of their day-to-day activities. I'm sure the ING customers amongst us will be able to comment on the result for them. Anyway, I want to also pick up on another. In fact, there are two questions that are perhaps related to each other. One is that can regulators use Regtech themselves, or should it be that the organization that's receiving the regulations needs to be the one that deals with it? And there's a related issue, which is shouldn't Regtech get more involved before the new regulations are implemented? So on both sides, it feels like that's a connected thing. Yeah. Kevin, would you comment on that?
Sure. So a bit of context about Regtech, and I mentioned that the regulator is the other stakeholder that's very heavily involved in getting more interested in this. I can certainly speak from a UK perspective as well as Singapore. I think there are other people here who have experiences in other regulators who would be keen to hear as well. But the regulators themselves has realized that the toolkits and capabilities that Regtech is providing the banks can also be used by themselves to improve their supervisory abilities. Because effectively, a lot of the tools today are data, analytics, mining, looking at what the data is telling me, which is effectively what the regulator needs to do to oversee a particular banking process to make sure that it is still sound, and then we can still trust that from a customer perspective and from a financial market efficiency perspective. So in the UK, for example, the FCA has been very advanced in this. They've had Project Innovate to sort of umbrella their fintech developments, but they have a specific Regtech focus within that. And what they've been driving, apart from sandboxes, you guys have heard about sandboxes, a safe environment to test out a new prototype, using regulated data, for example. But what the FCA has done is run hackathons. And those of you unfamiliar with hackathons, in the past, it used to be write some code to solve a problem. Now, really, it's 2 days of brainstorming to come up with a better concept of ideas. They call it a tech sprint. So the FCA actually has now run 5 tech sprints. I think they're going to launch the 6th in various topics. But the 2 interesting ones were one on regulatory reporting, where in running the tech sprint, they realized that one element where they can actually facilitate Regtech is to make their rule books more machine readable. So right now in compliance, what happens is that they send out a rule, compliance reads it, writes a policy, and sticks it on the wall. And so the interpretation of that is left to the many people down the road. But with natural language processing, which organizing the rules a bit more, you can make that semantics and the meaning more applicable to a computer that you can be automated. So they are looking at that, and that came out of one tech sprint. Another one they did was more recently on the whole AML and fin crime area. So they're using this, you talked about banks being agile, regulators being agile.
It's a whole new game.
Yeah. So they're using this as their experimentation to learn about this, working with various groups where they can bring in collaborators on this to help develop their own thinking about rules and deployment. And it was very clear when we spoken to them in the past, they realized that writing the rules shouldn't be the end of a regulator's job. They should also be measured on how well it gets implemented in the system. Mm-hmm. So when you look at implementation, it's more than just writing, confusing rules. It's making sure it's easily absorbed by the institution that need to now deploy this with their actual actions.
Okay, and there's one question that's received more attention than others. So, Casper, I wonder if you would have a go at it. It says, organizations that apply technology to generate, govern, and analyze relevant data will have market advantages. Do SMEs have the budget and resource for it? You said, it costs a fair amount of money still to do this stuff.
It really depends, because it doesn't necessarily have to be very expensive, because of course some of them, the companies that we're working with, of course want to do everything half the time. But I think, again, coming back to the point that they need to figure out where's the pain points here. And they can actually be solved very easily, right? There's actually just right now a hearing in progress in the EU where the Nordic banks want to join forces. At least some of the banks want to join forces in building a common KYC engine, which makes completely sense. But I think that's also one of the reasons that we are partnering up with some of the consultancy firms, to actually building standardized building blocks. So they can just tap into that and be compliant and pay some kind of annual fee for this consultancy firm. But to answer the question, yes, it costs money, really costs money. But I think the real question here is, do you can you afford not doing it? Because it's only one time where you don't comply with regulations, right? Then it will cost twice as much as the whole system would have.
Okay, we're going to come back to asking you some more questions. But Floris, I can see you're quite busy out there. Do you think we can have one picture just to give us a feel for where you're going with this? And it says, I guess not every experiment in accounting can be a success. Witness protection program. Do you have that in Calcabis? Can you put your software into witness protection programs?
Well, we haven't looked into the area, but I'm pretty sure it's
It
doable.
might be possible,
yeah, because it's basically just putting some kind of facial recognition and all of that. So it's doable. Yeah, but
okay.
I'm not seeing the potential in terms of money.
I noticed Audi's CEO is being held up because he might tamper with the evidence. So maybe there's another opportunity for offering solutions to companies.
Well, there are a lot of opportunities, definitely. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Floris. And for those of you who want to see more of his work, then I can promise you that we'll get to see a lot more as soon as we've concluded this session, because Olivier is promising an absolute bonanza of pictures. Is that right? Yeah, he's now committed. All right. Well, let's go back to this. Now, we've got an audience here where one person confessed to being in a bank. These are accountants. How do we translate Regtech to accountants?
So I'm not an accountant, and our firm doesn't offer accountancy services. I think I can tell you from my own experience and seeing what we do. If I break accountancy and take the broader term, there is certainly the audit side of things. I think we talked, and we had an innovation audit panel previously, where you're looking back and seeing whether things are following the standards and the rules. That's one area where they are using digital data analytical tools to support the audit function a lot more in banks and making that real time. Now, when I say audit, the people looking at it tend to be from risk audit and legal and compliance audit, may not be financial audit particularly, but certainly with the audit approach to looking at how we've done things. I think if you look at some of the new rules that we're working under currently, like MiFID, there is this need for transparency, best execution, having an audit trail. So being able to capture that and making that more auditable in getting towards real-time basis, there are tools looking at that area as well. The other area I would say is more, our firm does a lot of forensics for lawyers, and I think those who are forensic accountants among you, it's looking through structured and unstructured information to see whether you can find the evidence to support or defend the case. And those are areas, again, it's around data analytics, making use of a big universe of different data types, and having that work in your favor. It's not new, but I think the capabilities out there and the tools coming about this give you more capability in the forensic side. Whether that is Regtech, I think if you put it in the context of a bank, it becomes Regtech. Outside, it may not be because it's not regulated.
Okay.
Well, I think it's important to say that auditors need to comply with regulations as well, right? So I think that is where the Regtech fits in. And then there's a term called audit tech, and that is everything else, right? So basically doing the same exercise as we do in CalcuBiz, so figuring out, okay, what does an accountant actually do? What type of information does he need to have? How does he interpret the new taxation and all of that? So again, you can break it down, right? It's basically about breaking the knowledge down to building blocks so you can replicate those, right? So basically, it's the same thing as building pixels in a television, right? So if you build as many pixels as you possibly can, those pixels have different purposes. So when you stick the information into your computer screen, then it will give you the most nuanced picture that you can actually have. It's basically the same here. So everything is rule-based, right? We act on stomach feels and all of that, but basically it's rule-based, everything that we do today.
So can you give me an example of a Regtech, of a customer who wants some kind of solution where you're able to offer your tools? Perhaps not from banking, because Kevin, I'm going to ask you the same question. Can you walk us through a particular customer example? And I'm sure yours is going to come from banking. Is there something you can share? Perhaps not from banking.
We are looking into a case with one of the largest banks in the world, where they need to comply with regulations across the region. And they need to have all different types of inputs in terms of, the beneficial owners, where are the company based, how is the money flowing, and all of that. So they need to figure out how is the regulation impacting this specific client, and how can we actually comply with that. So that could be an example. A different example could be, the whole onboarding process with the fraud detection on top of it. So, but that again, that requires that they have the access to the transactions, right? So then they can start doing the analytics part that then will give a data input to the rest of the ecosystem that from there will cross reference all the information and figure out, okay, what is the most reasonable output for this. So again, it can vary a lot. We also have a very different project going right now where we need to comply with the regulations within healthcare, right? So again, coming back to the point saying we know everything about AI, we don't know anything about anything else, because that's basically up to you, and you get paid a lot to know that. So we know you know it. So we just want to anchor that so you can actually scale that information and use it internally, or you could also use it as robo-advice, right? Because if you're trained a computer to do something, why not as well sell that service to a client that wants to, know everything about taxations, right? So there's a lot of business opportunities for you as well to look into.
And Kevin, an example?
So I'll give an example that is not related to onboarding, and there are lots of examples in onboarding and various permutations to that. This is more to do with traders. If you run those of you who've seen an investment bank, you have huge desks of traders doing trades on behalf of clients or for the bank's books. And what you find is, if you look at SocGen, you look at UBS, there's oftentimes history where someone's gone rogue and hidden accounts, and then suddenly lost a lot of money when the bank discovers this, even though there's so many controls around the books and limits at the moment. So there are firms now deploying real-time tools. It's a bit like Big Brother's watching you, and they are watching you on trading floors, and you sign up to this. Now, you can't use your mobile phone on the trading floor, you can't text, you have to use the sanctioned firm chat device. So what they do is they map when you log in, what you do, the conversations you have, when you leave the desk to go and take a bio break, and they map all that and they run it day to day. Because they found that when someone shows up at 3 in the morning suddenly, turns on his computer, does some other things, which is not normal, that gets flagged to the supervisor on the desk who didn't realize he was here at 3 o'clock to find out why do you need to come in at 3 o'clock. So there are, I would say, real-time data collation tools analyzing this and looking at behavioral patterns where there are some rogue fraudulent behaviors which people want to flag before this potentially happens. Now, whether they catch the person or not is to be seen, but certainly there's a lot more supervision now with this supporting a desk manager, for example. So there are tools in investment banks where they deploy this just to show the human side of controls versus the other sides.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to ask you one last question before we go back to some of the Slido questions, which are developing in an interesting way. But this one question I have here for you is, what would you recommend to an accountant who says this Regtech sounds interesting, I want to know more? How do they go about it?
Well, if they only want to know more, they can call me up. Yeah, but I think it depends on what outcome you want to have, and is it in terms of the Regtech part, or is it in terms of the audit tech? Because there's two different things basically. I would say the Regtech, I would presume that it would probably be the compliance audits that wanted to know more. But in terms of audit tech, I think there's 3 steps that you need to consider. Of course, you have a lot of data already. Use it. Do some analytics based on that. But bear in mind that the outputs, if you only combine analytics, you need to be aware that the positives and the false positives, they will pile up, right? And somebody needs to look into that. So I think start small, use the data that you have, and actually process it in a way that you can standardize it afterwards. So yeah, again, it depends, because artificial intelligence can support everything. It comes down to, are you specific enough in terms of what do you want to gain from this, and how do you do it today?
So consider your data, start with something small, and think about how you can standardize the process behind it.
Yeah, we worked with the bank at one point where the onboarding department, they had a KPI in terms of how many typos they made from putting information from a passport, which is a very simple task to solve, and everybody have measurements in terms of where is the pressure in terms of we losing money, right? Mm-hmm. And usually it's a very small area that is very easy to standardize and automate. So yeah, start small and scale fast afterwards. And again, it doesn't cost very much to actually test different technologies today. I'm not saying that you should try us, but try other companies, because I think it will surprise you how much you can actually gain from very small investment.
So Kevin, I noticed you weren't rushing in offering help, but if somebody were to start on this process, what are your steps?
I mentioned this before. I think it's really understanding your problem area and determining, as reflected before too, what am I trying to solve here? There are a lot of tools and organizations out there that you could approach and have open conversations to learn about the space. I think one thing about Regtech, FinTech, is the people in the ecosystem are very approachable, just for you to understand what are potential tools. There'll never be a perfect fit around my area of problems, and you'll probably get a handful, if not 10. Everyone is certainly willing to experiment, and I think that's where you will need to make sure that you have very clear measures of what you deem as success in the process, because success may not happen on day one. You may not get the solution, but you may learn a lot of things, fail, cover 25% of the solution, but that could be a win. So be very clear that it's a journey to get to the solution. And I think with that mindset, you set yourself up for success rather than closing the project and spending money after the first checkpoint. I think the other thing as well is you have to recognize that some of the startups you deal with may have great technology, but the firms or the organizations, the founders, the management team, the shareholders behind that technology may not be as robust as maybe an IBM or some of the old firms. So you'll need to also DD the firms themselves, not just the tool, because a lot of times you've seen tools be the best tools, but it fails because the management has gone their separate ways, for example. And if you are responsible for getting a solution, that's part of the landscape of issues you need to deal with in this Regtech startup domain space. You can always turn to a big name. They'll have a solution. It may not be best. As you say, you won't get fired for hiring IBM. Whether you get the right answer or not is for you to decide. You might decide that you weigh two particular firms, IBM for argument's sake and a startup, and say, let's take these two along the path of a prototype pilot internally and see at the end of the day, who do I want to work with? I think the other thing I would say I mentioned before is don't be the only person in your organization. There's quite a lot of skill sets you need to bring into the tent. Make sure you have a common view of that. It's IT, certainly from the bank's perspective, compliance, legal, because then you know that you have got the right constituents in place to move forward. Otherwise, you'll always have to go back to IT, and there's someone in IT saying, no.
Can't do that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to jump to a couple of Slido questions. And there's one here that I guess is quite close to my heart, because it says accounting rules are often principle-based rather than rules-based, especially true in Europe and certainly true in the integrated reporting area that I've been involved in. Can you still apply AI and other Regtech solutions when you have a principles-based environment?
Well, definitely, and again, coming back to your point, Kevin, I think that there's different ways of succeeding, right? If you can automate stuff with 10% or 70%, it will also be a success for somebody. And I think that is one of the dangers of deploying artificial intelligence. You need to have a human in a loop, as one of the debates also touched upon earlier. It's very important to understand that AI can be a supporting tool and should be a supporting tool, but for the time being, and if you're working with a closed environment, of course you can automate everything 100%. But since it's a dynamic world and you need to have human interpretation and all of that on top of it, it's a human in the loop process, right? So AI can support, but it cannot, it should not automate everything. The computer should be trained by humans, and if there's a lot of repetition and the human being is vouching for that information, then you can put it in as a specific rule to do it constantly. So, yeah, it's a work in progress. This AI, you don't go out and implement something that will work from day number one. It requires resources to get it up and running.
And also, it's interesting that what is a principles-based environment in the external might get translated into certain rules inside the business.
That's the whole reason that we actually tailor artificial intelligence and don't create one-fits-all solutions, because they will never fly. So we have standardized, toolbox. So basically, consider you as an architect and us as a carpenter. So you provide us the information and the drawings of the house, and then we build it, and then you can paint it yourself with the color that you want it to.
And Kevin,
I concur with that. I think if you look at how Regtech, it's I think beyond the next big thing. I mean, we see it more as it's now becoming more mainstream in bank and financial institutions. So the compliance heads are thinking of, how do I change my resource talent? I'm not going to replace someone with a robot or AI, but I need someone who is able to now navigate what we call a bionic capability in making judgment-based, risk-based analysis and decisions. So again, on the principle side, you could move a lot more things to the computer, but you'll still need a different, a human in the process, but with different sorts of skill sets and focus at that point in time.
And that's the man with the machine rather than man versus machine idea.
There's also a lot of requirements in compliance that you need to have a human what do you call it, wing off. You have to approve it by a human being, but nobody says that the computer cannot collect you and provide you with the most reasonable answer that you need to approve in the end. So again, it's a supporting tool.
Okay. There's another question here which says there are European Commission initiatives looking at harmonizing and improving regulations in financial services. If they succeed, do we still need Regtech?
I think so, because as we mentioned before, the Regtech is a tool, an enabler to help be more efficient in you adapting your environment to take on these rule sets. So the rule sets may become more streamlined, efficient, great. You may reduce complexity, that's part of the equation. But whether you still have the need to do fin crime and using tools to analyze your ultimate beneficial owner, the flows of cash, source of cash, the tools that Regtech provides will still be there. And covering the rule sets around that. The rule doesn't go away for financial crime, for example. But I think, like we mentioned before, there are two sides to this Regtech story. Or three sides. There's the startups, there's the banks, there's the regulators. The regulators, if they streamline their rule sets, make it more consistent, if they automate it, that's going to facilitate how the banks deploy it with the Regtech solutions, with the startups.
So it's a tripartite process at the moment. All right, we've had a number of questions, and I'm conscious that we could keep talking about Regtech for a long time, but I suspect Olivier is really keen to show up and provide his commentary on how the day has gone. So I'd just like to thank both of you for coming along, for sharing your insights. There's a lot of detail that you've shared, but also some big picture stuff that we can surely take back and think about how that works in our context, whether in a bank or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you.